Now we're going to continue our discussion on energy systems, focusing specifically on renewable and sustainable energy. In the first part, we talked about conventional energy resources and their impacts. Now we're turning our attention towards alternatives, how they work, how widely they're used in the US, and what challenges still stand in the way of wider adoption. In this section, we'll look at the major types of renewable energy, including solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass. We'll also look at how renewables are currently used in the United States and just how much energy potential they actually have. Finally, we'll talk about energy efficiency, green technologies, and social economics and political barriers that affect how quickly these systems are adopted. Renewable energy comes from sources that are naturally replenished and won't run out on a human timescale. Solar energy works by converting sunlight into electricity using photovoltaic cells. It's flexible enough to power both individual homes and massive solar farms. Wind energy uses turbines to convert moving air into electricity, and it's most effective in open areas or offshore locations that have consistent winds. Hydropower relies on the movement of water, often through dams. And while it is reliable, it has very significant effects on river ecosystems. So, a lot of the time, it can slow those river systems down, it can cause stagnant water, it drastically impacts those ecosystems. Geothermal energy taps into heat from within the earth and works best in regions that have tectonic activity. Finally, biomass uses organic material like wood or agricultural waste to generate heat and power, although it still does produce emissions when those are burned. This chart from 2022 shows how renewable energy is used in the United States. One important milestone from this year was when renewable energy produced more electricity than coal for the first time in US history. This shift is promising for long term declines in coal use because it results in rapid growth in wind and solar. And that was driven by technology improvements, lower costs, and policy changes. On the technology side, major advances began accelerating in the early 2000s, and especially after 2010. Wind turbines became taller with longer blades. This allowed them to capture more energy at lower wind speeds and across more regions of the country. Solar photovoltaic technology improved through better materials, higher efficiency cells, and scaled up manufacturing. As production started to increase, the cost fell rapidly. Over roughly the last decade, the cost of solar dropped by close to 90%, while wind cost fell by about 70%. These declines made wind and solar the cheapest source of new electricity generation in much of the United States by the late 2010s. At the same time, battery storage technology improved, particularly after 2015. Advances in lithium ion batteries, driven partially by the electric vehicle demands, made it easier to store electricity produced by solar and wind, helping address concerns about intermittency and reliability. This allowed utilities to integrate more renewable energy into the grids without sacrificing stability. Policy changes were equally important and unfolded over a much longer period of time. Federal support dates back several decades, but momentum really increased significantly after the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which expanded tax credits for renewable energy. The production tax credit for wind and the investment tax credit for solar were especially influential, making projects more financially viable for utilities and investors. Although these tax credits were often renewed in very short cycles, they did create consistent growth in renewable capacity throughout the 2010s. At the state level, renewable portfolio standards adopted by many states between the 1990s and 2010s required utilities to generate a certain percentage of electricity from renewable sources. These policies guaranteed long-term markets for wind and solar, encouraging large-scale deployments well before coal declined significantly. The most recent and impactful policy shift came with the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. This provided long-term tax incentives, grants, and investments for clean energy, energy storage, and grid modernization. Unlike earlier policies, this legislation offered certainty over a decade, allowing companies to plan larger investments with confidence. Meanwhile, coal declined due to a combination of factors, including aging infrastructure, rising maintenance costs, environmental regulations, and competition from cheaper natural gas and renewables. Many coal plants were retired during the 2010s, which reduced coal's share of electricity even before renewables fully surpassed it. What's especially striking is that the United States has far more renewable energy potential than it currently uses. In fact, estimates suggest that the United States could produce up to 100 times its current energy demand using renewable resources alone. The limitation isn't availability, it's infrastructure, storage, policy, and investment. In other words, the energy is there, but the challenge is capturing and distributing it efficiently. In this map, we can look at these blue areas that kind of surround the outer portion of the US. These are areas where there's high potential for wind energy. The areas in yellow are for solar. The areas in green are a combination of wind and solar. There's some areas, mostly out west, that have geothermal potential. And then these little blue dots that you see kind of scattered around, those are existing hydropower generation sites. So they have potential for hydropower. Beyond switching energy sources, one of the fastest and least expensive ways to reduce emissions is simply using less energy. Energy efficiency means performing those same tasks that we do on a daily basis, like lighting a room or heating a building, with less energy input. Examples include using LED lights, smart thermostats, and energy efficiency appliances. For example, LED lights, they benefit by using less energy than your typical standard light bulbs, but they also release less heat, which in Florida, that's really important because if our houses are heating up faster, our air conditioning runs more. So by having LED lights, it also reduces the need to run the air condition as much. Green technologies go a step further by transforming entire systems such as electric vehicles, smart grids, balancing energy demands, net zero buildings, and carbon capture technology. Despite the benefits, renewable energy adoption faces several major barriers. Globally, countries differ widely in how they generate electricity, largely because of geography, history, and political priorities. Nations like Iceland and Norway have embraced renewable energy because they have a lot of natural resources that make renewables practical and affordable. Iceland relies heavily on geothermal and hydropower, while Norway generates most of its electricity from hydropower thanks to its mountainous terrain and abundance of rivers. In contrast, many countries remain dependent on fossil fuels because they lack easy access to renewable resources. They might also have investments in coal, oil, or natural gas, or their entire economy can rely on fossil fuel industries for jobs and national revenue. Even in countries that want to expand renewable energy, aging infrastructure is a major obstacle. Much of the existing power grid was built decades ago to deliver electricity from large centralized power plants, not from decentralized sources like wind farms and rooftop solar. Integrating renewables often requires expensive upgrades to transmission lines, substations, and grid management systems. Energy storage is another key challenge because solar and wind are intermittent. They only produce energy when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. Without sufficient battery storage or backup systems, utilities struggle to maintain energy supply with demand. Political and social factors also slow transition. Renewable energy policies can face resistance from elected officials who prioritize short term economic concerns, or they may represent regions dependent on fossil fuel production. I do want to emphasize these are legitimate concerns because people still need jobs and they also need economic stability. So, when people advocate for more renewable energy, it's important to consider these concerns. In doing so, it turns discussions with policymakers into collaborations rather than battles. Another barrier is industry lobbying by coal, oil, and gas companies that can influence policy decisions and delay regulatory change. In addition, misinformation about renewable energy, such as exaggerated claims about unreliability or cost, can reduce public support and create confusion about the benefits of transitioning away from fossil fuels. Economic barriers further complicate things. While renewable energy is often cheaper to operate over its lifetime, the upfront cost of building wind farms and solar plants and grid upgrades and storage systems can be very high. At the same time, fossil fuels continue to receive significant subsidies, which artificially lower their market price and make them appear more competitive than they truly are. These subsidies can discourage investment in renewable energy, even when renewables offer greater long term economic and environmental benefits. So, together, these geographic, technical, political, and economic factors explain why progress towards renewable energy varies so widely across countries and why the transition, while promising, remains uneven and challenging.